Inside of the deadliest concentration camp of the Second World War was an execution site which became infamous and terrifying with the amount of slaughter that occurred there. The German army would, during World War II, create a number of sites where they would execute millions of people. Some of these were extermination centres, such as Treblinka, where trains dropped victims off before they were driven to their deaths by guards, who would whip and beat them. But there were other sites which were less organised, such as graves and large pits which were dug by the victims, before the SS executioners turned their weapons on them. There were also prisons which utilised devices, such as the guillotine, or the German Fallbeil as it was known, and Hitler himself would order some of the proceedings of these executions to be filmed, so he could watch his ruthless justice being carried out upon people. But sat between blocks 10 and blocks 11 in Auschwitz was a death wall, which became known as the firing range of Auschwitz, and hundreds if not thousands of people were shot by firing squads or individual executioners in this way, against the wall. Join us today as we look at the horrific death wall of Auschwitz, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Auschwitz was the largest concentration camp set up by the SS, and it was a place where over 1.3 million people would be held inside of the barbed wire. But around 1.1 million people were killed inside of the camp, in the gas chambers, and by the conditions of the site, which included torture, executions and beatings. The SS guards would become known for their beatings of prisoners, and guards such as Irma Grazer would patrol with her whip and pistol, willingly shooting inmates when she wanted. But this all led to Auschwitz becoming a place of immense terror and fear, and blocks 10 and 11 helped towards this reputation. They were two large brick buildings which struck prisoners with so much fear that they would walk straight past them as quickly as they could. They would not even want to look at these two buildings. They knew what horrors were occurring inside of these, and inside of Block 10 there was a lot of human experimentation that took place. Doctors such as Josef Mengele would inside of the camp conduct brutal experiments on prisoners who had been selected, and many of those victims who were summoned to the block would know that they would not make it out alive. These prisoners would be infected with deadly diseases, and many were subjected to such horror they would never make it out alive, and they knew they would be affected for the rest of their lives with their injuries. But inside of the block next door, there was more punishment and suffering, which was carried out on the inmates of the camp. Block 10 became known as the punishment centre of Auschwitz and the camp, and there was a large number of interrogation rooms and prison cells where Gestapo agents and the SS would investigate. But also inside of Block 11, prisoners were taken through the doors to be tortured for information, and they could be dealt with in a number of different ways. Medieval-style methods such as the manacles were used to subject inmates to an ordeal where they would happily give over information relating to possibly resistance inside of Auschwitz. But there are also standing cells, tiny dungeon-style prison rooms in which a victim would not be able to move or sit down. They were locked in this for a long period of time, and these elements of the camp were known for being immensely cruel and barbaric. These cells had hardly any oxygen for prisoners. However, the link between Block 10 and Block 11, in physical sense, was a courtyard where executions would be carried out in the open air, and inside of this courtyard was a firing range, which became known as a death wall for its brutality. The death wall, which can be seen inside of Auschwitz today, is a close reconstruction of what the execution range looked like when it was being used during the Second World War. It was found close to the two blocks, where suffering was so closely linked to, and it was made to deal with huge numbers of prisoners who were sent to Auschwitz. As the Second World War erupted, and the Germans conquered new lands, thousands of prisoners a day were being sent to Auschwitz, and many were dispatched in different ways inside of the camp. Much is known about the gas chambers, but prisoners were shot in pits, hanged on gallows, and were injected in the hearts with lethal injections inside of hospital blocks. But many people would be sent from around Poland to Auschwitz for their executions. There were many Polish people who, on behalf of the general government, were sentenced to death and were shot on the death wall. The firing squad would begin to work near to the camp, in a gravel pit of a quarry, but then after some time the majority of executions by firing squad, or by gunshot, from autumn 1941, took place inside of the walled-off yard where the death wall was found, against the structure of the wall. The first executions on the death wall took place on the 11th of November 1941, and the victims at this time were shot in the back of the head on what was Poland's National Independence Day. This mass shooting was meant to send a statement against Polish prisoners, and there were 151 prisoners who made their way to the death wall, one at a time. They were forced to take off all their clothes, and their hands were tied behind their backs before they faced the executioner. They were told to stand against a wall, then from behind, an SS man approached them, and then coldly shot them in the back of the head with his rifle. Following this, a Catholic mass was held in memorial to those who were killed. It wasn't just men who suffered their fate on the death wall, as women were also condemned against this, and they were killed in the same way. Some were allowed to undress in a separate room to the men near to the courtyard before they would be led to the death wall, and then they had their arms tied before they were then shot. The ruthless and infamous commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, would state of the executions of those on the death wall that execution orders arrived in an unbroken stream, and that the SS had to deal with these ruthlessly and quickly. Another SS officer would claim that some of these walking skeletons had spent months in their stinking cells, where not even animals would be kept. They could barely manage to stand straight, and yet at the last moment many of them shouted, "Long live Poland," or "Long live freedom." So facing death on the death wall, many of these men tried to remain defiant in the face of the evil of the SS, their enemies. But following the shootings, a number of prisoners, who became known as the Sonderkommando, would arrive. They were then tasked with disposing of the bodies. They picked these up and loaded them onto the back of trucks before they accompanied them to the crematoria, where they were disposed of in the crematoria oven. At times it was known that smoke was coming from these buildings most of the day, and throughout the camp's operation, the crematorias could not keep up with the demands and the destruction and slaughter. Many of those who were executed on the death wall were never officially recorded in the camp's records at Auschwitz, and because of this it's not possible to calculate the exact numbers of people who were shot on the firing range. Many of those were prisoners of war who should have been given better treatment. After being captured by the German army, and around 4,500 Polish prisoners were condemned by the courts, and many of these were of course shot after arriving at Auschwitz. Also many Soviet POWs were sent from other prisons and military camps to be executed inside of Auschwitz on the death wall. It's believed that thousands were killed on it. Around 10,000 Polish people were sent to Auschwitz, and many were not registered and were executed and slaughtered. Around 1,000 Soviet POWs died at Auschwitz by execution, and many of these were shot on the death wall. It's believed, according to estimates by the Polish government in exile during the Second World War, that 11,274 prisoners and 6,314 prisoners of war were executed in Auschwitz, with a large proportion of these taking place on the death wall. These included a large number of people who had been arrested, suspected of being involved in the Polish resistance. But following interrogation, the Gestapo would mark their cases as requiring execution, then the SS would carry this out. Firing squads were usually made up of members of the SS, and these would be gathered inside of the courtyard each day to condemn different prisoners. These were considered the most virulent Nazis, who believed what they were doing was in line with the Nazi ideology, and there were large concrete blocks or sandbags placed in front of the wall to protect the firing squad from ricochets when they fired upon the victims. On the 7th of October 1944, a mass execution occurred against the death wall. 200 members of the Sonderkommando had risen up, and the prisoners who were tasked with collecting bodies and burning them decided to try and fight for their lives. They knew if they did not, they would be killed, as every now and then the Sonderkommando would be liquidated to protect from the true crimes of the site getting out. During this, an overseer was thrown inside of a furnace into the crematoria alive, and others attacked SS guards with stones and hammers and other weapons. But in reprisal for this, the SS became even more ruthless. They would carry out huge mass executions of the prisoner population, and hundreds of members of the Sonderkommando were dragged to the death wall, where they were shot. Prisoners were also whipped and beaten to death in the open, and in the courtyard of the death wall, and prisoners could be heard screaming in pain. The death wall of Auschwitz was just one of the different execution structures used inside of the deadliest concentration camp to take the lives of prisoners on a daily basis. It was used as a site to strike terror into the hearts of the inmates, and each day people would hear the rolling sounds of gunshots coming from the courtyard relating to the death wall. This whole area of the camp was notorious for suffering and death, and prisoners would hurriedly walk past as they knew the terror which was occurring there. Today the death wall still stands, and despite being a slight reconstruction, it marks the site of a memorial to those who lost their lives at the hands of executioners between Block 11 and Block 10. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.